I circumvented the note. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's great to be here. I need to start with two apologies. One is that I'm completely jet lagged. I just arrived this morning after 15 hours of flight, and this is 10 hours difference from where I come from. So apologies for whatever is going to happen. And then the second apology is that I'm a little bit going to cheat now. And the reason is that Katrina asked me to give a broader talk, but I'm really enthusiastic also to share an uncooked idea. So I'm just going to combine the two and just let's see what happens. So I'm going to talk about my research agenda over the past couple of years, and that is governance by AI and the way it intersects with democracy. So this combines two interests that I have, both in law and computer science on the one hand, and on the other hand, my concern with the decline of liberal democracies. And in a nutshell, I think that one of the reasons we are experiencing a crisis in democracies is that we have moved from governing by rules to governing by algorithms and data, and the checks and balances that were built to safeguarding our freedom and restraining the power of states in liberal democracies are actually tailored for a system that governs by rules that is doing a completely different thing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this and about why I think there is a problem. I'm going to demonstrate this or to focus on a particular context of content moderation and the way in which we govern the public sphere. And then I'm going to offer an unbaked proposal. And so this is our plan. My interest in this, in governance and thinking about the way in which apps are governing our behavior has actually emerged from my intimate experience with Waze. This is an app that was developed by a startup company in Israel. I have a lot to say about this. It was purchased by Google. Even the driver that brought me very early this morning was using this app. And this is a social navigator. How many people are using this? Okay, so in a society like Israel, where everyone is using this, or in other contexts when everyone is using this, Waze is doing a couple of things. And one is that is really of interest to us here, and that is a way in which Waze is supposed, or this app is supposed to find the shortest route for each of us as drivers to our destination. But what I've found myself in many instances is that I drive on the coast road in Israel, and everyone is driving using Waze, and all of a sudden people are starting to drive to take another pass, and I'm with them. And I always wonder, why is it that sometimes I get to take, this very, longer way, and others are getting the free highway, right? Because all of us had to, or some of us had to go the other way. And that made me start to think about the dual role of these apps, right? That they're serving not only the interest of their subscribers, but to some extent, they need to maximize the social welfare of those users, right? It doesn't mean that it takes into account all the social interests. And of course, in the context of Waze, there are many that have to suffer from the heavy traffic that goes through the neighborhoods. But it does have to take into account more than, or to optimize more than my own interests. And I think in this way, we can also think about social platforms as having to mitigate some of the interests or conflicting interests of a lot of their users, and to some extent some of the externalities that they're inflicting on others. And I'll try to demonstrate this in the context of content moderation, or the removal of content. And so when we think of these systems making decisions that are based on the collection of data, the processing of data, the prediction, and then the action that follows, when we compare this, when we think about these systems as governing our behavior, and we think about the tools that we have, right, in liberal democracies for safeguarding our freedom, there might be some, these systems might be incompatible. So what do we have? And these are just, this is not an exhaustive list, of course, of our checks and balances and safeguards for our freedom, but we can think about civil rights as a restraint on the government use of power, right? If we have a right, then the government cannot violate it unless certain conditions, procedural or substantive are fulfilled. We have another principle of the rule of law, where in law we would say that a citizen could, like the principle of legality, for instance, right? That everyone is free to do everything that is not prohibited by law, or that the government cannot do anything that is not authorized by law, right? And this is another way in which we govern or limit the use of power by government. And we have separation of powers, where we have a division of labor, but also a division of powers between the three branches that are competing with one another, assuming that that could safeguard the freedom of citizens. So when we move to the governance by data and algorithms, in this way that Facebook is governing our behavior, or our public sphere, or the Waze is governing the traffic, of course there is a problem of privacy and surveillance. This assumes a 24/7 surveillance, collection of data. The more data you collect, the better your governing model could be. But I don't want to talk about this, because all of you are going to talk about this. So I was assigned to talk about issues that are beyond privacy, and let's talk, for instance, about the way this is challenging, some of our fundamental rights. So if we have a presumption of innocence, and we normally think that we should not be stopped if we are not suspected of anything, right? The police doesn't have the authority to do that. How does it fit with predictive policing, where we actually want to predict? We predict that we are going to commit a crime, maybe. To what extent our notion of reasonable suspicion could be a right, or a civil right, that can actually protect us in this environment, and we can talk about this a little bit later. Another problem is that once we move to governance by AI, we're looking at governance that is happening on private spaces, right? The servers of private companies. It is using proprietary programs that are, normally would be protected by intellectual property, and therefore would be beyond or would create at least barriers for us to oversight it. And data that was discussed in the previous, in our morning session, data would be owned by the platform. And I think this is something that we need to actually take into consideration, where we have a lot of the focus this morning was about privacy as a driving force behind restrictions on the use of data, but there is also ownership, right? Who owns the data, and who can prevent others by the right, by the physical ability to prevent access to close the API of Facebook, but also by the legal right to prevent others from using that data, either for creating their innovation, but also for allowing the public to oversight whatever it is that is happening there. And here again, what is really interesting is that when we think about restraining power in the context of governmental power, we normally would think about separation of powers, right? And here we look at private companies. I think Palantir is really an interesting example where you have the Facebook of police stations that are actually accumulating data that is used for various methods and applications of predicting policing. And Palantir is a private company. A lot of the restraints that we have on the use of governmental power would not apply, even though governments would actually send or share their data for processing and learning by the models of Palantir, and then get the prediction and apply it in the way they are actually using the resources of the police. This is just to give, I think the bigger context is I also I thought was missing from our morning discussion, therefore I thought that I should mention it in this talk, is actually that this all sits in a market for data that is very different from the markets that for tangible goods, in the sense that this market is based on collecting the data, processing the data, creating these models that are being used for the smart cities and autonomous car and personalized medicine. And then these products are actually fitting back into that model of collecting better and more data that can actually refine our models. And so those who are into this process are actually enjoying or benefiting from the advantage of controlling all of this data. Just to give it a context again of some of the issues that we were discussing this morning when we were thinking about targeted advertising, we talked about the fact that if Facebook allows advertisers to create their own advertising policy on Facebook, then some of the restrictions that meant to protect the privacy of users are no longer useful. But at the same time, that would create at least some competition among the advertisers working in this ecosystem. Otherwise, Facebook is actually the only player because it actually benefits from that feedback loop that is a big chunk of it. In one study that we've published earlier this year, we were actually looking at the way in which this system is affected by the use, or this market is affected by the use of data for some governmental functions that are not done by the market, like in Palantir, or like the removal of content that I will describe in a minute that is being done by Facebook or YouTube, or the traffic control that it could be done or is done by Waze to some extent. But when it is actually done by the government, how introducing the government, when the government want to use this type of data that is being used and collected by companies, can actually distort this market and have some bad effect on the market by reducing the volume of information that is being collected, but more importantly, the quality of data that is collected, and thereby also affecting the type of data-driven innovation that is being produced by these the data and these models that are based on that data. So overall, when we look at innovation by AI in this context, we really need to reconfigure some of these checks and balances. We cannot use the same rights and processes and institutions that are securing freedom in this environment, and we really need to innovate. We really need to think what it is that we want to protect, and what would be the right institutions, processes, and rights that would protect these values. To simply take fairness or discrimination and apply it to this environment might not be useful. So let me demonstrate this in the context of content moderation by AI, and this is definitely a growing field, but not that new. It's actually, it is something that has evolved over the past 3 decades, and it is happening in this environment, right? Where we have platforms that are actually controlling access to information. Yeah?
Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I understand where you're coming from, because for me, governance, I tend to think of as like governments.
Right.
But are you thinking more like...
No, I think governing... Yeah, that's why, that's what I meant by the example of governing behavior by ways, right? So ways, you can say, well, ways is not governing by behavior. But it does, right? I mean, you can have ways tell you, how to drive or where to go. Ways can actually tell you where not to go. It can actually block some streets, either because they think that it's inappropriate to go in some areas, or because it gets some instructions from the government. These are governmental functions, to control the traffic. So it can substitute for in some countries it's ministries or municipalities that are doing this type of job. And it actually manages the traffic of a lot of drivers. So this is not like a personal tutor that is telling you what to do, but also, an app that is taking into account. So in this sense, I mean, governing behavior, and in the context of content moderation, that would be governing a public sphere, right? Deciding what could we read, what type of information, who could read what, what would be removed.
Sorry, can I follow up? Just also, but the checks and balances you described maybe don't apply as well to private companies.
That's exactly the point. That's exactly why it's a problem that the checks and balances are tailored for a government that is for states, right, and for government organs that are working. But envision a world where all of these functions would be done, like police by Palantir, content moderation by Facebook, okay? So it's great that we have this Bill of Rights and the checks and balances, but in fact, we live in a world where there are no restraints on power, and that is something that we need to address. That is the challenge. All right. And so a lot of what we call content moderation, and this is for a lack of a better word. If you have another way of describing it, I would love to, or articulating it, I would love to hear. This is what we think of when we think about enabling content, allowing access to content, but also making decisions about removal of content that could be hate speech, that could be terrorist propaganda, that could be copyright infringement, that could be defamatory statement, and that is in a dispute between two people, right? That's a lot of content could create harm. It could create harm for communities, for individuals. A harm from one person could be free speech for another person. All of these decisions are being made by platforms that are actually facilitating access. It facilitates access to users and controls data on users. We've seen that in the morning session. It facilitates the content itself, because this is either linked from the servers or actually hosted on the servers. and it facilitates the dissemination system, right? Access to the distribution system that allows us to connect with one another. So these platforms have become gatekeepers or were really attractive as gatekeepers, and that is something that goes back to the 90s with the development of the internet. So we have a regulatory regime that was called, for instance, to give an example, the context of copyright, the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, created a notice and takedown regime where you can actually complain about content that is allegedly infringing, and the platform would have to remove that content if they want to be immune from potential liability for copyright infringement for hosting videotapes or pictures that might be infringing copyright, but were uploaded originally by one of the users of that platform. Very soon after the DMCA and a similar European regime that created this notice and takedown, we've seen a lot of technologies that are actually implementing it. So some technologies were not actually waiting for anyone to issue a complaint, but simply filtering things that are suspected of copyright infringement, or actually blocking access, right, to some members of the public, restricting access. So there are lots of things that are not mentioned in the law. This has also become a platform for business, right, and enabling, if you identify content, you can actually monetize it, right? And so platforms started to be engaged both in enforcing the law in governance, but also in maximizing the profit. That is what they're all about, right? But this has become a merged model of actually applying these two. AI has been implemented later on, where we started to have a new form, not just a notice and takedown, but takedown and stay down, right? Once we identified an infringing content, we can actually track the system and look for materials that are similar, right? Similar in the sense, if they could be identical, that'd be the easiest, but they could also just resemble that file by 30 seconds, by 30 minutes, by a few images, etc. So this is in the copyright context. The more pressure that was put on platforms, the more that they had to actually upgrade their systems in order to address the regulatory pressure. So I think things that we have seen in the copyright area in the 90s, and then in the first decade of the year of 2000, we now see in other types of potentially illicit content. So the German legislation is a good example, where platforms are required to remove content within 24 hours. This is something that is really difficult to do if you don't know, right? And you sometimes want to prepare yourself in order not to have to act so fast. Another proposal that would require, that is still being deliberated, I believe, by the European Commission, and that is a duty to remove content within 1 hour. That would definitely require, this is not just, this is content that is terrorist propaganda or allegedly terrorist propaganda, and that has to be removed within 1 hour of notice. Again, this, you cannot, in systems of that scale, you normally cannot wait for this to happen, and that's why we see a lot of AI systems that are actually on the ground. So we've seen that the massacre in New Zealand, right, where the system of Google and YouTube were struggling to identify the videotapes of the massacre in the mosques and remove them. We see Flickr using AI in order to identify infringing images and pictures that are being posted. We see a very interesting, this is something that is really, this was a paper. I don't think that that it was put into practice yet, but this is quite remarkable that, you know, live streaming is something that is very difficult to address, and to use machine learning in order to analyze chats that people discussing their plans, right, in chat rooms about a sport game, for instance, in order to predict whether they're going to live stream a sports game, like a football game in the UK Premier League, right? This is something that has been proven in a paper, but it just gives you a sense of what you could do, right? If you are using machine learning in order to predict, right? This is like, what's the difference between this and this? And this is a type of predicting policing as well. And live stream, of course, creates a challenge because you cannot match it. You cannot say this is the same content as, or even the same. Once it's live, it's already too late. So you want to predict it ahead of time. And of course, this is something that is challenging at various levels. And so what's the problem with these systems? The problem is that all this is happening in an ecosystem that is completely controlled by the platform. So you have content that is these are platform, right? They're supposed to be interactive, right? They facilitate access to user-generated content that is being uploaded by others. So let's just take the copyright example, or terrorist propaganda that are being identified by hashtags, or the copyright example where you have copyrighted material that are being identified by content ID provided by right holders, that want to identify their own content on the system. So users are, the T has jumped from the airplane. This is, and so you have this input that is being uploaded into the platform. The platform is doing the screening by AI that is being informed by the interest of platforms, as we've seen in Content ID, for instance, right? Those minimizing my liability for copyright infringement or for hate speech or for terrorist propaganda, but also maximizing my profit if I can monetize on this. So these are the platform's interests. And then we have the interest of right holders in the case of copyright, or the interest of governments in the case of terrorist propaganda. But these interests are being codified into that screening algorithm that has to actually do a very simple task, which is classifying between infringing or non-infringing, hate speech or not hate speech, right? This is the type of task. And take a particular action. What's more is that this, like every every machine learning system, this also feeds back into the algorithm and helps it identify these contents the next time. So if governments want to remove, for instance, propaganda of ISIS, that is what they're gonna get better in this, because that is what they do, right? Because of that feedback loop, even though there might be some content that is being removed, but it's not about that, right? And so just to give, there are plenty of anecdotes and a lot of empirical studies that we have done also at our center, and actually here at Berkeley. I think Jennifer Urban was doing a lot of empirical work on looking at the biases created by this system of automated removals. But this is just this is a recent example of how the Mueller report was being identified and removed on script just because it was classified as a copyrighted material where it cannot be copyrighted because it does not, it was created by the government, right? And governmental materials cannot be copyrighted to begin with. But that is what the system knows how to do, and that is what it is removing. And it's also bound to be mistaken just because a lot of these decisions related to content and whether this is legal or not, illicit or not, infringing or not, risky or not, depends on the context. And so an excellent study that was published in 2017 at Princeton was actually looking and analyzing these systems that are on the ground. Some of it has changed over the past 2 years. The systems are becoming better in also determining context, but as long as they're in contextual, these systems are less reliable. So the reasons we need to have a check on systems that are doing content moderation of that sort, removing content based on machine learning systems that are identifying illicit content. One is efficiency, and so we want to have some quality control. We don't want them to be mistaken. We don't want them to mistakenly remove the Mueller report. We don't want them to make mistakes in limiting access to important materials for public, in the public sphere. We also are worried about biases. And so we are concerned that in this ecosystem that is dominated by a platform and that is removed from any oversight, a platform would remove things that coincide with its own interest or not necessarily with a social interest. There is a problem of legitimacy and trust. We don't trust a system that is monolithic, right? I mean, we always think that there is some sort of check or some sort of oversight, even if not institutional, at least as the public could say, this is outrageous. But when things are removed and we don't even know that they are removed, and even to communicate that this is outrageous, we need to use a platform. It's a very interesting phenomena that people that were complaining about Facebook, Cambridge Analytica crisis were using Facebook as they were doing it. A lot of studies were just showing it because this is a platform where you can actually communicate. But if we don't trust the system, there is a problem of legitimacy. We don't trust these platforms because of their incentive structure. We don't trust them because they do not provide often that explanation and a justification for why they were acting in one way or not another. But the unbaked proposal that I have actually has to do with this. And the reason I'm less concerned about efficiency or quality control is because this is the interest of a platform as well. They want to remove the right things. So if it's a bad thing for them to remove things that are, if they after copyright infringement and they remove things that are not infringing, they run into problems. So I think that there are some good incentives in there. The problem of trust become now the problem of platforms after the hearings in the Senate, a lot of pressure that is put on platforms in Europe and elsewhere. So I think they're looking for areas where they can actually, what are strategies to enhance trust. But I think the problem that I want to focus is how do we restrain power? This is a dominant system that is making decisions without any restraint. And just to give us a reminder, we normally think of two ways of doing this check and balances, right? And when we think about content moderation, what should be removed? What should be considered illegal, right? An unacceptable speech is usually defined by the legislator as being, these rules are being implemented by some executive agencies, right, that are looking for these terrorist propaganda. And then there is judicial review of the executive, whether they were acting within their authority. Alternatively, we have market competition, right? And sometimes we say, oh, this platform is censorizing everything, let's move to another platform. But in this market, we don't have that. And that is one of the problems, is that this market is not working. It's not functioning like other markets. It's a very concentrated market. And so consumers' rights, or competition, the pressures that would actually secure our rights as consumers are less effective. And one of the interesting phenomena that we see now in content moderation is actually that the executive is using exactly this, so that they're using the way in which platforms are free to remove content in order to remove content that is less desirable for government. And just, there are plenty of examples that I can give. But I think that in the recent German law, we see that this has been used, and you can look at the data actually that was provided by YouTube, and you can see that a lot, that a lot has been removed. More has been removed based on community guidelines rather than simply by a request of the government, because this is subject to judicial review, and this is not. So the question is, how do we do that? And there are lots of proposals actually in the literature, and I would divide them, or I suggest that we divide them to regulatory proposals and more technological tools. And in regulation, there are proposals to insert more transparency. If we have more time in the Q&As, I will talk of why I think these are really weak solutions. Due process to counter, to have a right of appeal. We have that right. It is almost never being used. And auditing actually assumes that we know what's right, and we actually measure as a platform or the AI system to say it's working or not, right? It keeps up, but its own standards or the social standards, but we don't really know in these instances, or not always know, what's the right way of acting. In technological tools, we have attempts to reconfigure the system to say, you should take into account fair use. We are going to impose this on you, right? And then we will see in auditing whether the platform is doing this or not. Or tools that are more subversive of the, that are actually intend to act against, to empower users to act against, to circumvent the system and act differently as a type of protest of some sort. So my proposal is to look at, is to introduce contesting algorithms. And what I mean here, and I will quickly go through this, is first to, I propose to do something at the regulatory level, and that is to revise the safe harbor that we have nowadays. That is simply, your platform going to be free of any liability if you comply with notice and takedown. My proposal is that the immunity to the harmful content that is user-generated content will apply only if the system also consult a social system, on which I am going to talk in a minute. It is also based on computational dispute resolution, this idea of contesting algorithms, and it involves a human review. At the technical level, we will have this type of proposal will require us to, or facilitate the development of a system that will use machine learning that would be informed by social values and not only by the values of the platform that the platform now consider. And it would enable a check on content moderation in real time without deciding a priori or ex ante what is the right solution. So the system would be dynamic. So what I mean by that, I mean that we need to create an intervention. So after the screening And before the action, we have to require platforms to run these allegedly infringing materials on a system that is informed by social values. The input here could be observational materials, behavior of, for instance, nonprofit organizations such as librarians. It could be court decision, first and foremost, for courts that have decided particular cases that could inform the model. And of course, the counter notices of users. And that system would actually create some sort of another output, right? Either it would determine that a use is fair or no. Actually, what I envision is a system that would give some sort of a scoring. Now, yep.
So here's a couple of concerns. Can I ask questions, or wait to the end?
If I have 3 minutes, maybe let's just pull it together and then. All right. So the idea in terms of the input is that all of this data could be used to inform the model. But what's going to be new here is that we are going to have data on the removal itself. So any attempt nowadays to actually develop systems of that sort didn't have access to the main data that Google have, that Facebook have. Now, if we are going to require them to run it through the system, that could be used as one of the training data and would allow us to tweak some of these patterns that we create based on core decision or observational data. Again, the output I envision is more in terms of a scoring. And the last point I want to make is that this system is going to allow us to identify what are the social trade-offs that we have to make, right? And so that if the platform, for instance, determines or decides what infringement is, and the social system can actually come up with some answer about whether this is 30% fair use or 87% fair use or legitimate use for free speech or for some other reason. These two yes are going to be in conflict, and we can decide them. So for the first time, we will be able to actually extract from this monolithic system what the social trade-offs that have to be made. Some of them we can actually define by the algorithm, and some we can actually transfer to human review. I'm going to leave you with some of the advantages. The idea here is to do a move from a monolithic system or ecosystem to a more pluralistic ecosystem by just creating a computational voice to the social interest, from a system that is completely static in deciding values to a system that is dynamic and can actually give or address the monolithic decision of a platform in real time and not wait until a court would look at it in 5 years' time. And it creates an adversary that is not necessarily correct, but it's an alternative to something that is also not correct, right? It just creates an intervention that's simply trying to create a balance by designing an ecosystem where you have more dispute than you have today. There are lots of challenges. I will list some of them, but I really want to hear, and so I'm going to stop.
So this is Katrina will start our discussion, and then we have time for some questions.
Right. So thanks so much, Niva, for sharing these ideas with us. Just sort of a few comments, questions, directions that come to mind in listening to your talk. The first thing I wanted to do is pull out one of the points that you made in your talk that I think just is such an important one that we all ought to pay attention to it. So in your reference to your work on the Chilean effects of government use of data, You mentioned that the ways that data are used and protections we put in place for data can change the content of the data, can change the presence, the existence, the quality of that data. And I think this is an issue that is not sufficiently addressed or paid attention to, that we really need to think of equilibrium effects of an entire system. You can't just put a use in place, you can't put a protection in place in isolation, but there's an entire data generation and use process that needs to be analyzed. I think that's a really important point, not just in this context, but much more broadly. And so I wanted to draw that point out. Now coming to the contesting algorithms idea and the particular use case that you analyzed in this presentation, first, just a couple of tricky questions that this raises. The first of these is sort of who decides what the goals or interests of society are? There's more than one society, there's more than one group that needs to be represented in that process. Who or what institution puts in place this requirement that the platform needs to check with my authority, and what do you do when you have multiple authorities that the platform needs to check with and we need to aggregate their opinions in some way? Who checks that the platform obeys this requirement? How do you have some transparency to know that a platform is consulting the societal expert in the way that they're required to be doing so? Are there any technical tools that could be put in place for a platform to certify that it is following the protocol that you've laid out, that it's really consulting with the algorithm that it's supposed to be consulting with? And stepping back a little bit more, it's sort of a challenge to the folks with a technical background in the audience. What tools could we design to ensure that filtering choices are in some sense made transparent and accountable to the public? Is there anything that we could do to force platforms to basically have a paper trail and some way to make that process visible and auditable? One concern is that a process that only requires sort of a check when the platform wants to remove content or block content is only solving the problem in one direction. What about the content that the platform should have filtered but didn't? And that seems like a hard problem. You focused for a very good reason on the stuff that I want to take down because that's a small percentage of the content. But we really need checks in place for all the content. So how do you handle that? It seems like a real challenge. I like that the sort of the idea of contesting algorithms sort of reminded me of sort of work in adversarial machine learning that we see the sort of theme that if we build a system that we don't really understand, maybe we can build another system that we don't really understand in order to improve it. And I think that sort of thinking that way is really interesting. And I wanted to sort of, as the last point, to sort of wonder, are there other ways that we can use that perspective to help in this problem setting? So, I mean, as you mentioned, auditing is a really sort of fraught and limited tool for putting controls in place. And for one reason for this is that we don't have access to ground truth. We don't generally know what the right things to take down are versus the wrong things to take down. If we did have access to ground truth, maybe we could do something cool where we could have an algorithm that is an auditing algorithm that you could put in place that actually could test the system. Well, what would you do with this content? Well, what would you do with that content? It could catch the algorithm disobeying some ground truth or some societal norms. And I wonder if that idea can be played with even when we don't have ground truth. Some idea of a contesting algorithm that's actually interacting more sort of interactively with the filtering algorithm and is really trying to push it to its boundary cases, perhaps just to expose to the public what those boundary cases look like. You know, here are the hard calls somehow. Maybe that's something that we should be aware of. And so I wondered whether or not this perspective you're taking might be useful in other ways. So I'll stop my comments there and just say thanks.
Thank you.
And then I think we get to open it up to everybody. Comments, questions.
Well, I thought you just did a terrific summary of the points that I was going to make, actually. So, yeah, the same questions: who decides, what is appropriate and what's not appropriate? So, you mentioned the Christchurch Mosque. I'm a New Zealander. It's a much smaller, more homogeneous country, and so there's a lot more convergence. In a country like this, suppose that Mr. Trump says that hate speech against me is not okay.
Yeah.
So, and 46% of the country agrees. So, then they could impose that. We wouldn't like it, but they wouldn't like if we impose something on them.
Right.
So that's kind of the issue, even though I found this very provocative and very interesting and useful, so don't get me wrong, I love this conversation, but, it's who guards the guards kind of thing.
Yeah, I think these are excellent questions, and actually not that I have answers to all.
And then my second concern was, I really like the idea of having something automated. Having worked a lot with governments around the world, my faith in government intervention has become tested the more that I work.
Yeah. I agree with everything.
I was trying to find a really nice way of putting it.
But we need to, so that's why, first of all, I think that is why it's important to have a lot of strategies. And I think, for instance, subversive tools, I think, that to counteract power that is not depending on government is important. But I think it's not enough, because this is, I think this is, the ecosystem that we now have is really monolithic. This is really bad for free speech. And it's vulnerable for governmental abuse as well. I think in terms of the question, who decides these social values, I don't think of it as redefining society to begin with. This is something that we have, we each live in a country where we have a social contract. Maybe we don't like it, but this is our social contract. In this country, free speech is supposed to stop Mr. Trump from, decisions that you have described. And in New Zealand, free speech would be different, right?
Yes, for those of us who live here.
Yeah, that's true. But this is a social contract, right? And so I think that this should comply with a social contract in terms of our social contract values. The question of who is represented here goes into the details. And I think that those who are represented here should be the externalities of this. Those who are not represented here. So we have a criteria. Who decides, who applies the criteria? Again, I wouldn't reinvent the state. We have institutions that decide these things. Whether it would be a good question to ask, right? Whether we want to have a committee, a judiciary committee that would do that, who is doing the balancing, and that may change from one country to another depending on our constitutional framework. But I think that these are the steps to be taken, and I think that is, and I think that these values may change from, again, in some countries that would be one set of, but I think as a framework, this could also change over time. It's not, that's the whole idea, that it should be a way of deciding values and not a way of applying a fixed set of values.
I just want to reinforce this point, which is just because we often get these questions of who decides, and it's not a question, it's a question that it's not as if you say, oh, no, I shouldn't decide, it's going to be left unanswered. If it's left unanswered, then it's going to be the platforms who decide. It's not as if no one's deciding.
Right.
So I think that, the way you answer is exactly right, but it's to say that someone is deciding already, and now we need to counterbalance it in any which way that brings some fairer spread of values to the table.
Yeah.
Just another, I think it's very interesting, and I think one way to think about the institutional design, which I think is what we're talking about now, in order to make this work, is to try to draw upon some experiences in co-regulation that we see in some jurisdictions currently on the ground. So, for example, we heard earlier this morning about advertisements. So, in the UK, what they did is, because they didn't want the government to decide, and they definitely didn't want the advertisement agencies to decide, they set up this regulatory body that has its own deficiencies, of course. Any agency problem, any agencies generate agency problems, but what's interesting about that is that they set up juries that are comprised of, however you want to comprise them, and there are ways to test how they're comprised. And what's nice about your idea, I think, is that you can run simulations. Because you don't have ground reality, but you can have some proxy of what juries that are subject to certain externalities would think about those kind of issues. And as the more you run simulations, then you can add it into the feedback loop in terms of contesting decisions of platforms or of government. So if you see it as a triad of, you have government, you have platforms, but then you have some input from civil society, if you structure it in a certain way, then you can shift the burden of proof. You can shift the onus to say, well, why don't you justify your decision? Because we actually have an input on what those suffering from externalities view that to be. So if you shift the burden, and then you can at least get more meaningful deliberation on what should be the standard.
Thank you. Very interesting. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understand some of the arguments. So I'm curious, how important it is that some of this is automated or that it's decided by algorithms. Like, if we reach the same if the platforms were reaching the exact same decisions with some human-led deliberative process, would the argument be any different? Or is it that it's because the platforms are basically monopolies and therefore control so much of our interactions with each other, that is sort of the main problem, a lack of accountability with respect to any kind of subjective decision making, plus sort of having almost total control of a particular market. Those to me seem to be the ingredients which cause us to be concerned, less maybe the algorithms, but perhaps I misunderstood.
No, I think, well, first of all, I think this is a very good point, and I think that every time I come to work in these areas that relate to platform algorithms and data, it's very difficult to distinguish, and I agree with you, it's really important to distinguish. In this particular instance, the problem arises from the fact that this is AI-based rather than rule-based, because if we had rules, it would have made it easier. For instance, Facebook has community guidelines. This is governance by rules, right? And you can challenge the rules. You can challenge them, for instance, in European countries, or Israel included here, under standard contract regime, you can say, or a contract of adhesion here in the United States. You have the tools. When it is done by AI, the decisions about each particular removal is not based necessarily on these rules, right? It's a sort of an interpretation, of rules that is codified. It's dynamic. It doesn't have the same transparency. It is not ex ante. It depends on the training data and on the feedback loop. And we don't have a system to address it because we have consumers' rights or we have, a constitutional framework, but it doesn't fit the problem. So that's why I think it makes a difference.
I'm just worried that even in cases where we have humans doing these very upsetting, low-level content moderation decisions by hand, and even though they've been given this very detailed guide about how to make these decisions, of course they're going to be subjective. Of course they're going to have like their own limited training data, right? Like they're going to have a very particular way of thinking about the problem, given what they've been exposed to. And I'm just still not completely sure, like if there's something profoundly more challenging about algorithms than even having this process done in this highly distributed way with lots of people and lots of process.
So let me just give an example. So when we have decisions about who, predictive policing, right? We could be racist. The system could be racist. Police officers could also be racist. But then we have a way of addressing it, or at least a framework, maybe not successful, but we can actually take that police officer to court and question them and show that in his behavior before, during, and after, he was racist. And so, but what do you do with a system, right? How do you have to create a process by which you establish this or litigate it or challenge this. And I think it's more complicated because it's dynamic, because it is not ex ante, because it's not transparent.
Perhaps we get two last quick comments first, and then we continue over lunch.
Yeah, so
over coffee break.
First, I just want to say first that I really appreciated your talk, and thanks. Yeah, so my question is, you're motivated by this sort of issue of the monolithic Facebook and YouTube and so on. But what do you think about the concerns that if we keep adding more and more regulation and barriers to jump, that it will be impossible for competitors to ever arise because they need to start from somewhere, and so we're stuck into this monolithic structure?
It's a huge problem, I agree. And actually one of the benefits from this ecosystem is that at least it creates a market here that is a non-Facebook market. Because, if we ask Facebook to take fair use into account of YouTube, that becomes even, more, stronger, right? But this should be independent. That's the whole idea, that the system, even not perfect, should be independent of this. There should be adversary. And I think that creates a market here for independent software that could be afterwards, could be used also by librarians, could be used in non-platform context to identify algorithmically, these trade-offs.
Yeah, I have one question to you and one question to the room. And that was a fantastic talk considering that you landed at 8 a.m. this morning after 15 hours of flying. And it was beautiful and always thank you. So my question to you is, it seems that in your view of the world, law kind of stands as it is. Whereas with computation and automation, and I hope I'm not stealing Mireille's points here, law might be transformed itself, right? And I think also Julie Cohen makes this point, right? Like that with the Industrial Revolution, the legal system changed. So I'm wondering, where is a change in the law in your model? And to the room, and this is something I will try to talk about on Wednesday, I wonder how we came to this point. Yeah, I usually do privacy research, but I've been looking at a lot of the machine learning. And I'm very surprised that a lot of the research has focused on adversarial machine learning, where the service provider is benevolent and the evil is coming from the outside. But we haven't had this model questioned, and I think that Katrina did a great job of how you could literally reverse the roles and say, what happens when the service provider is malevolent? What kind of tools can we give to the users to escape the wrath of the machine, right? And I'm just wondering if we could maybe think about contestable machine learning or cooperative machine learning, which is not so centralized. Like even today, when we think about federated machine learning, it's at the service of a centralized service provider that doesn't look at the data.
Yeah.
And we don't have great research, or maybe we do, and I would love the citations, that looks at, and not multi-party computation, but like collective cooperative machine learning. So that's a question for the room.
Yeah, when did we stop thinking about open source and, right? And communities of developers. Yeah, this is a great question. About the law, I think this is an excellent question, and I've been thinking about this. Is once we take in the view that the social system could be informed by court decision actually assume that this is actually going to be processed, right, on an ongoing basis. So, the balances of hate speech and free speech, infringement and copyright. And that actually, might change the role of courts. I think courts that are functioning in this environment may have to undertake a different role. Can they make decisions against what the machine learning model is producing? Under what circumstances? What type of overview they could, what are the tools for them in order to, they have to oversight this as well, right? Sometimes, especially when there are these trade-offs to be made, when I think that this is changing the role of courts, but it could also change substantially what the rules are, right? What the trade-offs are, right? And I think that I think the idea of this system is to create a space for this. It's not that I know, I don't think that any of us know what the right balance is. We just know that there should be more diversity in the way we decide.
Let's let the speaker in the room answer more questions over coffee and take the speaker.